Hi. Come on up, and there's some seats in the back, and there's some towards the front if you're keen. Very brief intro to our host tonight, who's the wonderful Dina Nayeri, who we are lucky enough to have based in Edinburgh now. Who Gets Believed is one of my favorite books. The Ungrateful Refugee is brilliant. And I did not know from those two that she also writes and is interested in sexy things. And when I did, and then this book came up, I was like, this is the perfect blend. It will be so cerebral, so beautiful. So to introduce and to chair tonight's event is Dina Nayeri. Will you please put your hands together and welcome her and Melissa Febos.
Thank you guys for coming and in this beautiful location at Lighthouse Books. Thank you for everyone online who's joining us. We are so lucky to have the brilliant Melissa Febos here with us. Melissa and I actually met nearly a decade ago at a reading in New York. Yes. I guess unbeknownst to me, in the middle of a lot of what was happening in this book.
It was right around
But, you know, Melissa needs no introduction. She has had a string of incredible literary honors, has written for every major newspaper you've heard of. I won't go through them because they will be listed online. But in my opinion, she's one of the greatest nonfiction writers that we have in our generation anyway. We're about the same age. I'm a little older. Most recently, she's won a Guggenheim for her work, and I guess let's just get right into it because there's so much rich stuff to explore in this book. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for doing this with me, Dina. It's so good to see you.
It's a pleasure. I mean, this book was such a pleasure, and I know it's about celibacy, but listen, okay? There is some stuff in here you have to read. So starting at the beginning, about 9 years ago, you had just gotten out of a relationship that you called the maelstrom. Can you tell us about that and the journey into this?
Yes, I can. I had been in sort of in nonstop consecutive monogamous partnerships for most of my life, from my early mid-teens until my early 30s, and they had been sort of varying degrees of length, none much longer than 2 or 3 years, some pretty peaceful, some not so peaceful. And then in my early 30s, I got into a relationship that, I really was just trying to be descriptive and not necessarily poetic by calling it the maelstrom. It really felt like I was sucked into a vortex and spat out 2 years later, and sort of everything in my life was somewhat ravaged. And I'm sure there are people here who have had that experience. Most people only have, a psychotherapist who I interviewed around that time said most people only have one. I only had one, thank God. But when I came out the other side of it, I hardly recognized myself when I thought back to sort of how I had behaved during those 2 years. And I thought, wow, I've been doing this for a while. I should be better at it by now. I've been in therapy for 20 years, and I had been in recovery from drug and alcohol addiction for over 10 years at the time. And I thought, how the fuck did this happen? Like, how did this happen? And everyone who knew me well in my life had been telling me for quite some time, like, maybe you should take a break in between. And I would be like, sure. That sounds like a great idea, but I'm actually already seeing someone new. And at that point, I think the pain I was in was acute enough. I was scared enough of the dissonance between how I thought of myself and what was actually happening in my life. And so I decided to spend 3 months celibate, which many of my friends laughed at me.
I did too when I got to
I expected that. But I wasn't planning on writing about it at the time, and I really wanted to do it. I wanted to stick to it, and I knew that if I decided to spend a year, it would be like a just one more situation. And so I started with 3 months, and 3 months became 6, became 9, became a year, and I was in a very, very different place by the end of that year.
So how were you behaving, I guess, differently before? Because one thing I noticed, and before actually you answer this, I have to tell you that I related to so much in this book, even though our experiences are so different. And for me, this book, it was almost like looking at all the things I had been ashamed of, the behaviors I'd been ashamed of, and like some of them I realized were just me trying to survive. It's okay to behave that way, and others not so much. So how were you behaving before you made this decision that made you think, I'm going to do this?
Sure. You mean in relationship, in all of those
Yeah, in
relationships?
relation to other people and yourself.
Sure, sure. I mean, I had a very clear story about myself, and I really held on to it for a long time, and that was part of what was creating that kind of dissonance between me being sort of chewed up by this maelstrom and being like, but I'm so good at being in relationships. Like, why is it ruining my life? It's so odd. And I thought I was good at being in relationships because I had a really big emotional vocabulary. I'd like read a lot of books. My mother is a psychotherapist. And I was working really hard. I was working really hard at my relationships. And I thought that exhaustion and sense of labor in my relationships and sense of compromise meant that I was doing a good job. But one of the sort of projects that I took on during that year of celibacy was really performing a kind of a literal inventory that really was a kind of autopsy on who I'd been in relationships, and really broke down like, what was that work actually? And what I revealed to myself was that I had been doing like macro to micro so much accommodation, avoidance of conflict, anticipating what my partner's wants and needs were, sometimes when they were explicit, sometimes when they weren't communicated at all. It was just my assumption that they wouldn't want me to go away that long on a trip with a friend or go away that long to do my work. Just like anxiously checking texts and checking, just like sort of this constant tending, whether it was asked for or not. And also a pretty significant degree of kind of eliding or minimizing parts of myself that were fairly intractable,
And I mean, you were doing so much cognitive work, so much creative work inside these relationships. But can you tell me a bit about empty consent? I love that phrase. You used it in the book. What was empty consent?
Okay, so empty consent is a term that I came up with when I was writing an essay in my third book, which is called Girlhood. And I'm deciding how much to tell you. So I decided to go to a cuddle party in I know they must have them in Edinburgh.
More, please.
This was in 2017. I had just started dating my wife, and I was like, how would you feel if I went to a cuddle party? And she was like, can I come? And so we went to this cuddle party, and as often happens for me before I write something, I thought maybe I'll write a fun little essay about the cuddle party. And then I went to the cuddle party, which was an amazing space. If you're curious at all, please go. The whole first 30 minutes of the cuddle party was basically a workshop in enthusiastic consent. And there were all these rules. It was like a really beautiful space where they had us do role play and practice, where you would turn to the person next to you and you would say, do you want to cuddle with me? And then the other person would say no. And then the person who asked first would say, thank you for taking care of yourself. Like, we did role play. And then we had the cuddle party. And as soon as some random stranger was like, do you want to cuddle with me? I was like, yes. And I cuddled with a bunch of people I did not want to cuddle with. And when we left the cuddle party, it was like my future wife and our friend who came with us were both kind of glowing with oxytocin. They were like a little bit drunk on cuddling, and they were like, wow, that was amazing. How was your experience? And I was like, fully dissociated. And I was like, horrible. I'm never going back there again. And in hindsight, pretty immediately, I was like, what on earth is going on? Like, I am virgin, middle-aged queer woman. I'm a feminist. I've been in therapy forever. Like, why on earth am I cuddling with people I don't want to? And my love should go back so that you can practice not cuddling with people. And I was like, I can't, because the same thing will happen again. And it sent me on this really long journey of sort of looking back at my whole life of touch and consent, really sort of more broadly. And I realized that I had been saying yes when I wanted to say no for my whole life. From like having coffee with people to, really just in every area, but particularly in areas of physical touch and physical intimacy. And so I had a long history of doing things I didn't quite want to do because it felt like there was a finite number of times I was allowed to say no. Particularly if it was a person I had entered into an intimate relationship with, it just felt like I could only say no so many times. And that had to do with sex, it had to do with all sorts of things in relationships.
I mean, at some point later on in the book, you talk about this kind of mantra that was almost like, I want to read it.
Look at her book with all these stickies. It's just,
I know, isn't it great?
I'm honored.
I mean, this is a book to read closely. But he said, if I am not wanted, I will die. If I am not wanted, I do not deserve to live. If I am not loved, I do not exist. What was that for you?
Dina.
Well, listen, let's get into it.
We're in it. No, I so appreciate you. This is amazing. Bracing. You know, I think if you're a person who is committed to raising your own consciousness, who wants to be awake inside yourself and inside your relationships, there's a lot of psychic exfoliation that needs to happen.
I love that phrase.
Even when, as I was, you were raised by a bisexual feminist and have seemingly been steeped in sort of a lot of countercultural messaging, a lot of like respecting your body, and you have the right intellectual ideals, like that is just a starting point. I'm sure there are many people here who are comfortable or familiar with the discomfort of knowing something intellectually and watching yourself behave in a completely counter to that knowledge. And so I think when I began this process, I really thought, like, I was truly baffled. I did not know how I had gotten into a relationship that I now know was emotionally abusive. And with all of the knowledge that I had, all of the work I'd done, like, how did that happen? And what ended up happening is this like slow scraping away of my story about myself, the sort of messaging about relationships and love and sex and intimacy and my own worth as a person, that I had internalized that were not my own ideas or beliefs, you know, really sort of digging down and getting down to the bone of it. And that's the bone of it,
yeah,
right? Is this inherited belief that I didn't intellectually believe, but that was really lodged inside of me, directing a lot of my choices. And it was both shocking and sad and an incredible relief to finally get to that point.
So you set about to change, and this is a huge, huge transformation. It's not about 3 months of celibacy. It's about deep internal change, no more empty consent, no more, listening to your body. And one thing that struck me is that this year, it wasn't about the removal of pleasure or like abstaining from pleasure, not at all. In fact, there's so much pleasure in this book, but it's about freedom from an other-centered life, a life that's centered on other people. Can you talk a little bit about that difference?
I can, yeah, and it's important for me to make the distinction, as I do in the book, between sort of other-centered in, and I guess the way that we refer to as people-pleasing, which is sort of an anxiety-driven centering of the other in order to secure our own comfort, right? A story I had about myself in relationships that I talked about before was like, oh, but I'm a people pleaser. Like, I do so much for my partners. And a very smart mentor who I write about in the book said to me, people pleasing is people using. And I was horrified when they said that, because I immediately knew it was true. And I thought, oh, right, I have been doing all of this work not in the service of the other person's flourishing, but in the service of my own emotional safety, because I feel that I am not safe when other people are disappointed in me, angry at me, upset with me, feel that I owe them something. That is like a fire alarm emergency inside of me. And so I'm doing all of this preemptive work to avoid a certain look on someone else's face, which causes absolute panic inside of me. And that is not what I actually think is an other-centered life. Like, my mother, the bisexual psychotherapist, is also a Buddhist. And so,
I love your mom.
Like, I grew up around the concept of also an other-centered life and sort of a service-oriented life. And I am oriented that way, and I believe in that. And I don't think that's what I was doing at all. I think that actually in order to show up for other people in a wholehearted way, we need to feel emotionally secure inside of ourselves. We can't be doing it out of fear. That's not generosity, right? That's management.
Right.
And I wanted to stop managing other people so that I could actually love them.
Right. And so that's actually a really good distinction, other-centered, something
I mean, it
different.
describes both, right?
Yeah, exactly. But, in, I guess, this process of being someone who is maybe a people pleaser, people user, you had this kind of arsenal of skills. You had the ability to charm and to seduce. And you talk a lot in the book about, I love these parts where you're like teaching your friend how to be seductive. And also this part where you talk about how, what is it? Charisma is like control over your, sexual power or energy. Talk about that. Because I should say that I'm someone who has zero control over her sexual energy. And so often I describe to my friends that I feel sexy, but I just do stupid stuff. And so I it's like being inside a sexy hamster.
Yeah. So I actually understand that. I understand that. Sometimes I feel like a sexy hamster too, or sometimes just a hamster.
Yeah.
Just a busy hamster.
So how do you?
Sure. I think, this is something that I didn't think about a lot when I was out there doing it because I didn't want to think about it. I just wanted to sort of be like, I don't know, it just happens, You just like feel a certain mood and someone's drawn to you and you make eye contact and then you're living together,
No, but in the book you summon them. You summon them with your eyes and they come. So tell us more about that.
Okay, so the thing about writing a book, I think when we were in the little green room at the picnic table over there, Dina asked me, wait, I just lost my train of thought. What did you ask me about?
I asked you a lot of things in rapid fire. Yeah.
There's a lady talking about to cry.
I know, isn't it lovely?
It's a big one.
I know.
You asked me why I didn't write the book closer to it happening. And one of the reasons is because I couldn't have described so many things that I describe in this book, and I was not brave enough yet to describe them because I was able to go through this whole experience, but I still had never quite written out the mechanism of seducing people. And I think it's convenient to not really think about that, but in order to write this book, I love that you're just letting it crawl on you. It's so sweet. It's just bumbling around.
Yeah.
I really, so I wanted to change my impact on other people, right? And so I had to understand what I was doing that was getting me into these situations, that was hurting other people, that was hurting me. Like I needed to make visible to myself and conscious the choices that I was making, because I was making choices, whether I wanted to look at them or not, right? Yeah. And so I had to sort of pull back the veil and think, okay. And there is a scene in here where a friend of mine is like, how do you do it? And I was like, I don't know, I can't describe it. And then she's like, tell me. And I did. And I was like, oh, okay, you can describe it.
Yeah.
Like the things you think are it's like the way that people talk about writing. You'll hear people, or I used to hear people pretty often say, oh, you can't teach writing. And it's not true. You can teach writing. You can't teach talent, but there are mechanics to it. It makes it less magical to talk about it, so people don't like to, but you absolutely can. And so I had to really sort of pull back that veil and look at how I did it. And so there's a lot of sort of thinking about what magnetism is and how it gets used. And I had to really think through how I used to use it and how I use it now, and if I feel good about that. Like, what is the correct application of magnetism? Which I think is, people with charisma or with magnetism or with seductive skill or however you want to describe it, I think are people who can modulate it. I think everyone has it to some extent, but for a lot of people, it only turns on when they're around particular people or in situations or feelings, not something. And then there are other people who can sort of turn it on and direct it at specific other people. And I think I still do that. I just don't do it in a romantic sense anymore or in a sexual sense. I think I do it with my students to make them love the art that I love, because when you're in love with something, you'll work really hard to do it well, right? And to make them see the beauty of something that I love. And that feels like a right application of that skill. Not to say that to seduce someone to have sex with them is always wrong, but it's not my business anymore.
Yeah, well, I mean, I understand, because then you're seducing them into something that is, like a safe place, a place that you want to share. It's very benevolent, giving, generous, versus, not trying to take from.
Well, that can be really fun, but I was out there always thinking I was about to fall in love with people, but actually quite rarely falling in love with people, which made me pretty dangerous for other folks, because I would be like, yes, that's it. I'm going to turn it on full bore. Sorry that you're
ghost them
on the hook here. Yeah.
It's
okay.
Not good.
It was not good.
We've all done that, been there. Well, I haven't.
Have we? I don't know if we, I don't think we all have.
I mean,
Maybe all of us have.
We've been with people who've ghosted us. Anyway, let's get to the celibacy. By the way, this ladybug is on my boob now.
Oh.
I know. So you said that celibacy is not your work, but that it would open up a space for whatever that work turned out to be. So let's talk a little bit about how that happened. Like, what was the space that opened up? Because you were spending a lot of time thinking about.
Yeah. I think I was like, okay, I'm just gonna stop. Yeah. And I think sex felt like the easiest way. It was so concrete, and it was like, okay, this is a part of all these relationships. So I'm just gonna stop that part. And then very shortly thereafter, I think I had some kind of flirtatious interaction, and I was like, oh no, it's that. More so than any physical interaction, it is that sort of all of the delicious brain chemicals that get released when there's chemistry happening, sort of pursuing it, trying to maintain it, the waning of it had taken up so much energy and so much time in my life. I used so much creative energy on that cycle, on the life cycle of sort of, I don't want to say love. Sometimes it was love, but often it wasn't. And I didn't quite realize the enormous amount of space it had taken up in my life until I stopped. And then within weeks, within days probably, I started feeling like, oh my God, I have so much time. Like and in the beginning it was very sort of like wellness journey where I was like, got a haircut and did a lot of exercise and donated a bunch of clothes and like checked things off my to-do list. And then when I decided to take a much more active role and to, undertake this project of really changing myself, it really consisted of sort of reflection and looking at my past role in relationships, but also nurturing the other relationships in my life. And, I think it ended up being one of the most emotionally intimate years all of from this single category, I was able to bring into every other part of my life. And I think that was a function not only of my own sort of obsessiveness, but also of the sort of cultural story that we have about love, where that is the place where we should look for intimate emotional fulfillment. That is the space we should look for romantic experience, right? And for like the greatest emotional depth. But actually, I have found tremendous emotional depth in my friendships, in my relationship with my art, in some of my family relationships. It really, and most of all, I think that opened up space for me to forge a relationship with myself that had been pretty absent from my adult life.
Yeah, and that took many forms, I guess. Spirituality and art, two of my favorite ones in here. But I wanted to talk a little bit about your relationship with both of those things, and also your body, just through your study of the Beguines. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh my God, I could talk about the Beguines forever. So,
who are they first?
The Beguines were this movement of women in the Middle Ages who were not nuns. They were not under church rule, but they were sort of nun adjacent, and they formed these collectives where they would leave their lives, often leave their marriages and their families. Some of them would have been unmarried, but they lived together in these kind of compounds that were surrounded by these really high stone walls. And they lived communally, like truly communally, and they were obsessed with their independence. Their code was independence, sort of mutual aid, independence on each other, but independence from sort of the larger social structures and hierarchies, and certainly sexual economies of their time and our time. And so they often started laundries or textile mills, and they would start their own businesses. They would own property. They would sometimes leave and like have affairs or marriages or children, and then leave and come back to the beguinage. And they basically worked as social workers, nurses, teachers. They would perform last rites for the dying. They really just worked in their community. They preached, they taught literacy, and they basically taught people to interpret spiritual literature on their own terms, which was basically illegal. It was illegal for anyone who wasn't ordained by the church to be preaching, and so they were often arrested. And they had to travel in groups because they were so physically threatened at the time. But they were also frequently artists, and they really lived lives that were in profound accordance with their deepest held beliefs, like incredibly brave, uncommon lives. And of course, they spread like wildfire all over Europe. It was the time when literacy was spreading. This was in Belgium and parts of what is now France. And eventually, of course, the church figured out what they were doing and how free they were and started burning them as heretics. But that actually didn't stop, some of them, some famous poets who were beguines were like preaching and reciting poetry as they were being executed. They were truly amazing women. And when I read about them, I immediately thought, okay, first of all, if they could do this, like I can do a bit better in my life. But also just imagining what it would have been like to be a woman or a queer person or a trans person or a non-binary person in that time, or just an ambitious woman, an artist. Like, what would we have done? We would have been in the beguinage.
Exactly. Actually, at some point you talk about how, it was for them not only freedom from the world of men, like for men celibacy was suffering, but for them it was freedom from,
Yeah, absolutely.
But that also it was, what did you say, something for ambition, and vessel for ambition, or,
a harbor for ambition.
Harbor for
Yeah,
ambition.
and I think even abbeys, were also, like, Hildegard von Bingen was like one of the most ambitious women of human history, like a polymath and politician, and I mean just a true boss. And that would have been the only route for her to accrue power and use it in the ways that she did.
So let's talk a little bit about some of her writings and some of the writings of the other women. There's a chapter in here. You know which chapter. There's a chapter in here which is about our sexual relationship with ourselves.
It is about the art of the autoerotic.
Exactly. Which is phenomenal. I think I read it 3 times. And then get off. But you describe her as having written the first first description of the female orgasm, and also just the way they related to their body and with ecstasy. Clearly, they were not talking about just the spiritual. And so I would love for you to read some of that.
I would be very happy to.
Yes.
Okay, I'm trying to decide.
77 to 80.
Okay. Like that of most nuns, the goal of Hildegard von Bingen's celibacy was to relate to God. But God didn't assume human form. The only human forms in her abbey were other women, and she worked her whole life to make it so. At their inductions, she dressed them as brides in extravagant white silk, their hair flowing long and wild. She had passionate relationships with some, though allegedly she never had sex with anyone. How then did she write the first description of the female orgasm? How did she know the sense of heat in her brain, or how the woman's sexual organs contract and all the parts that are ready to open up during the time of menstruation now close in the same way as a strong man can hold something enclosed in his fist? It was hard for me to imagine that a nun like her did not give themselves pleasure. I had given myself orgasms without even touching myself, aided only by a pillow or the force of my own mind. Perhaps they did not connect that phenomena with the misogynistic rhetoric of the church around women's sexuality that called it tantamount to evil. I like to imagine they interpreted it as a holy gift, a vision, a fruit of devotion, the hand of God himself. Do you want me to read the part about, okay.
Yeah, keep going. I'll tell you when to stop.
Okay. At the summer camp I attended as an adolescent, we played a game called Fishbowl, during which all of the girls would sit in a circle while the boys sat silently outside of it. In a following round, we would reverse positions. A female counselor would ask questions that the boys had submitted anonymously ahead of time. One of the questions they always asked was, "What does the female orgasm feel like?" "Convulsion," we said. "A bright light flashing, a ripe persimmon squeezed in a fist." The mystic's writings supported my hope. Begin Mechtild of Magdeburg writes of eating and drinking Christ in sensuous rapture, while Begin Agnes Blandbekin tells a bizarre story of conjuring the foreskin of Christ on her tongue and swallowing it, an act which racks her whole body with orgasmic pleasure. She repeats it 100 times. Catherine of Siena used Christ's foreskin as a ring when she wed him. Teresa of Avila writes of an angel who plunged his dart several times into my heart, and that it reached deep within me. When he drew it out, I thought he was carrying off with him the deepest part of me, and he left me all on fire with great love of God. The pain was so great that it made me moan, and the sweetness this greatest pain caused me was so superabundant that there is no desire capable of taking it away. Some of these descriptions read like straightforward erotica, Jesus fan fiction, that is sometimes quite kinky and seemingly stripped of coy metaphors. Others, like those of von Bingen, seemed more like oneness with the world, a spiritual experience achieved through the body, as so many are. The female mystics claimed a desire to yield to the divine, to disperse their selfhood in the universe. Superficially, these expressions appeared to reinforce a familiar edict for the feminine, to submit. But the mystic saints' descriptions of yielding often sounded nothing like submission. When the divine wrote through a person, her voice might more resemble that of a god than a supplicant.
That's good. Perfect. Thank you. Let's give her a round of applause. By the way, how are we doing on time?
You got another 10 minutes and then...
Okay, good. I have time. Okay, great. So very in touch with themselves and in touch with writing and art and spirit. You know, this one of the things I loved about this is that it reminds me of the Sufi mystics, because I was telling you before that my dad, you know, we're Iranian. He's a Sufi and he studies Rumi, and all of these traditions have such a way of connecting the physical with the spiritual and with a kind of a sense of rapture.
Yeah, it's really true. And so much of what happened that year and sort of the places that I ended up when I was writing this book, they start with a single behavior or, I don't know, some kind of external manifestation of something. And what I did that year and what I did also while writing the book was really try to winnow it down to the root of it. Yeah. And they all sort of led to the same place, right? Like chasing other people and sort of using them as a kind of, to feel a certain way, right? Yeah. This kind of extractive way of sort of using other people, which doesn't necessarily have to be extractive, but in some ways it was for me. Or even writing and making art, right? And even I, as a longtime addict in recovery, I think many forms of addiction, many expressions of the addictive impulse at their furthest reaches, when you factor all of those experiences down, they come to a spiritual kind of core, to this kind of very basic, fundamental, very human longing for a kind of depth that we express in lots of other ways, sometimes harmful ways, but that at its core has no moral value.
Yeah. Like you talk about your truest self, which is only accessible when you're alone, and that true self is the self we're constantly denying in our desire to please other people. It kind of made me think also of how you, the Beguines and all of us women, we were kind of made to feel selfish for listening to that truest self, and in the book you kind of show it as the opposite is being a terrible person isn't so much listening to that true self as much as it is just constantly changing yourself for other people.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's actually pretty intuitive. Like if you all think of a person that you know who is constantly obsessed with pleasing other people and how it feels to be around that person and how it feels to interact with that person, it's a little tough.
Yeah.
It's a little like nobody's home,
Yeah.
right? Or it's exhausting,
Oh, yeah,
right?
yeah.
And if you're around someone who is really in touch with themselves, who really has listened to themselves and is secure in their relationship with themselves, they're not looking to outsource that through other people and how it feels to be in communication or in connection with that person. I mean, it's a much deeper experience, right? That person is much more capable of giving.
Yeah. Well, it comes back to that whole thing with the kind of singular, what was the Dillard quote?
Oh, yielding at every moment to the perfect freedom of single necessity, right?
Yeah, let's talk about that.
So I have that line tattooed on my shoulders, and only literary tattoo that I have.
I didn't know you had a tattoo.
Yeah.
I love that line. It's such a good line.
There's this essay, Living Like Weasels, that I love, of Annie Dillard's, where she basically writes about a way of living, right? Which is sort of locating a true impulse, a true sort of that core longing, and basically leading a life of devotion to what you believe in, to what is true to you. And to me, I think the essay is in many ways about the life of an artist, right? But that is sort of looking at it from the outside in. It's looking at the object of what you can devote yourself to, but I think it can apply to anything. It can apply to the concept of love, or to your family, or to a religious belief.
But the point is, it's a single devotion. So if
Yeah.
you've got it directed toward, love or sex or whatever, then it can't go elsewhere.
Exactly, and the simplicity and kind of freedom of devoting to one thing, because then at every turn in life, it's like, no, what will bring me closer to that thing?
Yeah.
What will serve that one devotion?
Yeah.
You always have the answer, right? And what I love about it is that it's sort of like a little coin that you can turn in a different way, and a single necessity is also a way of describing addiction or compulsion or people-pleasing, right?
Yeah.
And the difference is agency, right?
Yeah.
The difference is choice. Have you chosen your devotion, or are you a captive to your devotion, right? And I wanted to go from being captive to my devotion to choosing my devotion.
Right. So I think for both of us anyway, at least, that single devotion is writing and
Yeah.
art. And I think, just going back to that whole thing of what is a terrible person, I think a lot of us writers all get accused of being terrible people for
Yeah.
being devoted to that art. There's so much kind of permission and freedom in this book around that as well.
Yeah.
But can you talk a little bit about that? What happens when you hurt someone with your writing? Or,
Yeah.
I remember my ex-husband at one point said to me, Dina, is nothing sacred? And I said, and it just came out of me. I said, no, my writing is. That's sacred, And then I realized that was all that was sacred.
Yeah.
Gosh, maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, I think in some ways, I don't know, a sacred can mean different things to different people. I would say that
I think they disagree.
I think they agree. I think that's our chorus cheering us on. I would agree with you that the writing is always sacred, right? Like, that does feel sacred. The practice of it feels sacred. And other people's privacy isn't always, unfortunately. And I don't feel proud of that necessarily, And there are definitely instances where other people's privacy wins, where I will want to include something and think, that's not mine to tell.
Yeah.
But I have to say there aren't that many.
Yeah.
And there are definitely relationships with people where I will ask for permission first, and I will show it to my wife. I always show her the stuff that she's in, and if I have an active relationship, I try to extend the care that I give to that person in my writing as I would in life, which means I'm not going to promise to give them exactly what they want all the time, but I will be honest with them. I will try to communicate directly. I will hear how they feel about it. I will show up for the process of sort of moving through it with them and try to make a conscious decision and not run away from the ways that it impacts them. And the onus of that does make me decide more carefully than I did when I was younger, because it is harder to sort of show up for how your choices affect other people. But for the most part, I do think the writing is the part I would call sacred.
Exactly. Well, and it's not just that. Like, it's not just what you choose to put out in in the book, but just the time that you spend with it. You talk about the perfect partner for you is someone, describe that, because at the end of the day,
Yeah.
you didn't stay celibate forever.
No,
You're
I
married.
didn't. I didn't. And towards the end of that year, one of the sort of animating questions was, okay, so, at that point, I truly was very happy to never be in a relationship again. Like, I really thought, if that is what happens, I will be fine with that. And if trading what I have gotten this year means if I have to give that up in order to be in a relationship, there's no contest.
Yeah.
Like, I will never be in another intimate relationship. But if it is possible, how can I imagine that, right? How can I imagine my way into a different kind of relationship than any I've ever had? And who is that person? And I went to Virginia Woolf's house. I thought about, and I had always thought it would be impossible to be with another artist because we do have to be so selfish, at least in the eyes of others.
Yeah.
And I thought, and I think I even said in kind of a quippy, annoying way, probably, there's only enough room for one of me in any relationship, right? Because I just needed a lot.
But you're with a poet.
But then I thought, oh wait, but if we both want the same thing, and the thing is time away from each other, like, then taking is giving. And so actually perhaps another artist with the right temperament would be the only person I could be with, the only person who would understand what I could need. And that is exactly what happened.
Yeah, and I think it's such a better description of love. Like a really wonderful line from Rilke. Do you know that one about how love is two solitudes that meet, protect, and greet each other? Yeah.
Yes.
And that's what this sounds like. It's wonderful.
Yeah, no, it really is. And I think, I also, when Danique and I met, I explained all of this whole experience to her and was like, here are the things about me that I now know that are probably never going to change.
Yeah.
And she was like, amazing. I'm so glad you know that and have told me.
Yeah, that's amazing. Can I have one last question? Okay. So, just kind of connecting this back to the Sufis and my own experience of reading this, there's a game my father used to play, which was, he would take a drink and open up Rumi and run his finger down.
Bibliomancy.
That's right.
Yes.
And whatever came up was kind of a prophecy. And in this book, you play that.
Yeah, I have my whole life.
Yes. So there's a passage from Audre Lorde.
Yeah.
Will you read it for us? That you found it in a bookstore, I guess, shortly near the end of
I'm going to butcher it if I don't find it. What page is it
244 and 245. So every time my dad plays this game, whatever comes up is always just about more drinking.
Have you guys done that bibliomancy? When I was a kid, I just wanted words to live by. I wanted a little fortune to tell me what to do. I mean, I have a stellium in Libra. I have a hard time making decisions. But I think I also had a head full of like what other people wanted all the time. And I just wanted like one thing. I wanted the perfect freedom of a single necessity. And I was looking for it in books.
Wonderful.
Okay, so wait, 244.
Let me see. You should start where I thought
it's
about
the-
Agnes. It's on 244.
Wait.
245.
245. Ah, yes.
I thought about Agnes at the bottom.
I thought about Agnes Martin, Octavia Butler, the Beguines, Hildegard, May Sarton, and Nan Golden. There was plenty of hideous shit in their lifetimes, and they turned again and again to that most reliable higher power, art. I had faith in that practice, in the great shell of history that held us all, in the work of listening through divine reading, of speaking back into that vastness through art. It was the divine that would hold my hungry parts, that had enough love to quiet them. This felt like a weight-bearing fact, something to lean into when my other resolves weakened. It would steady me. I cradled that faithful feeling between my palms like a birthday candle. When I got home, I wrote the words my finger had found in the bookstore and tacked that scrap of paper over my desk. I want to live the rest, this is the quote, I want to live the rest of my life, however long or short, with as much sweetness as I can decently manage, loving all the people I love and doing as much work as I can of the work I still have to do. I am going to write fire until it comes out of my ears, my eyes, my nose holes, everywhere, until it's every breath I breathe. I'm going to go out like a fucking meteor. Thank you so much.
That was amazing.
You're amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Oh my
I don't
God.
want to yield to the audience, but I have to. So do we have some questions from the audience?
Is there any here? There's one online while you guys are warming up.
I have 50 more.
So this is from Joy. It's so interesting to hear of the people-pleasing sexual acquiescence in queer dynamics, as I've always experienced those as a more marked aspect of heterosexual relationships. Mm-hmm. But that's an observation, not a question. I was wondering about how we are socialized, and if you see women of different generations having different relationships with intimacy and sex and pleasure.
Should I repeat some of
This
that?
one's
Do you want to read it in?
because it's on. Oh, the online people can see it because it's online. Wow. I will say just about the comment part of Joy's question that I too thought that I would be exempt from those dynamics because I was queer and because most of the relationships I had been in, especially leading up to this period, had been with women. And so I thought, like, it doesn't make any sense. Why would I be doing that kind of work? And it just doesn't matter. I mean, we all grow up in the same soup with the same bad ideas flying around. And so I can definitely enact some really bummer heterosexual stuff in queer relationships, unfortunately. And that's interesting. Have you noticed among generations? I mean, for sure, like my grandmother just never even talked about sex ever. Yeah. Like never explained it to my mother, nothing. And my mother was very popped out, our bodies ourselves. She was very second wave feminist, bought me books, explained genitalia in great detail as soon as I was curious. There was no sort of hiding things, but there just weren't words for some things, like when I came up with the phrase empty consent, I was still looking, I had revealed this dynamic, this experience that had happened consistently over the course of my entire life. And I had polled over 100 other women and men, actually, and they had all experienced it throughout their lives, and there was no word for it. And I thought, how could she have taught me about this? There was no name for it. That was just sex. Like having sex you didn't want to was just sex. And it was sort of a punchline about marital sex, like, you just have sex you don't want to. You have to. It's part of it, which was shocking to me when I decided to really look at it, right? And so I think each new generation gives words to things that were unspeakable or even unseeable to previous generations. But I also do notice a difference not only between generations, but between different life stages. Like women after menopause talk a lot more about stuff. There's definitely like a commitment to one's own truth and a comfort with one's body that comes, over the course of a life, I guess, but certainly later in life, it's more comfortable.
I agree. I think the biggest difference actually is between the various phases of my life than say me and my mom too. She's an Iranian, raised in Iran, and she has changed so much in the various phases. Yeah. I like the not giving a fuck. I see Sam. Is Sam over there? Hi, Sam. Another question?
Is there one in, I was going to say the room, in the garden? Yeah,
over here.
Back here.
Hi. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You have that in the book.
I do, yeah. I write about that in the book, yeah. 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 Yeah, I believe there's a hashtag boy sober.
So we have to repeat the question.
Yeah, the question is about the questioners also went through a revelatory period of celibacy and sort of wants to communicate the power of that to their daughter, who's 21 and in a very different space. And is there a way to talk about this that's legible to someone at that life stage? I don't know. You know, I spent 300 pages trying to articulate it, so I don't know if there's an easy way, but I do know that there are a lot of young people who are talking about it. Like, there are people of her generation who are fluent in this, and they're probably coming at it not from a place of experience or over-experience, but something else. But I just, in the course of promoting this book, I was on a podcast that was about being boy sober, or it was like a celibacy podcast. Gen Z people. I don't really know what they're up to, but they seemed really cool. And I mean, the thing that I know about, my mother gave me so many good ideas, and I carried them in me until I was ready to see them. And so I think in a way it doesn't really matter what words you use when she's at a place where that's applicable to her, if she's ready to apply it, like, it'll be in there somewhere. So I think I really believe in the power of just sharing our experience, you know? Thank you. Hi.
Okay. I was, doom scrolling earlier today, and I'll admit I didn't read the article because the headline was a little too ridiculous for today, knowing that I was going to be coming to this conversation. But the New Yorker just published an article, and the headline is something like, "Why aren't Gen Z people having enough sex?"
Love the enough.
Right, or like, why don't they have sex anymore? And it was just like really bizarre. One, really bizarre that they just came right out and said that in the headline for the New Yorker. But that's also a lot of the conversation happening right now, and being American, and knowing that certain people want certain people to have more babies, and it's I don't know, like, how does that factor into the conversation right now about celibacy and like going off the young people engaging this thing?
I mean, I think at its core, dynamically, it's just more of sort of the same problem that got me to this experiment in the first place, which is other people prescribing what sex should be or what anything should be to another person in their body. Like, that's just absurd that any person could use the word enough when it comes to, could prescribe the right amount of sexual intimacy to another person is so offensive. But I also think, like, also young people are having sex, or they're not having, I think it's creepy that older folks are obsessed with how much sex the younger generations, like, mind your own fucking business.
Exactly. And I think, the future generations are just a lot more in control of themselves about this.
Yeah.
My 9-year-old daughter won't even let me hug her.
Yeah, or there's just like, there's so many strings attached to it culturally. Like, it actually makes a lot of sense that they would be a little more trepidatious. I sort of wish I had been,
Me too. Yeah. Other questions?
Time for one more, a burning question. So shy.
I have a lightning round of definitions, if you do it.
Okay.
So finish with a game? Okay. Okay, so
Dina, can I just bring you on my tour?
can we get the definition for the following words in one sentence? Procrastinator.
Okay, so when you have some work to do, or for instance, if you are writing a book or an essay and it's like you want to be working at it, but you want to just do something else for like 3 to 7 minutes first.
So, okay, great. So 3 to 7 minutes.
You just want to have a little treat before you buckle down.
Great. Okay. What about sex Roomba?
Okay, sex Roomba goes back to what this knitting questioner commented on. A sex Roomba was sort of the way that I came to think of other people who were trying to use their magnetism on me when I was celibate and I had really divested and really stopped and was like not interested anymore. Then people would come and try to flirt with me, or I would see them like flirt, like just sort of cruising around, and they were like Roombas where they were just like and it was that unsexy where it was just like their batteries were powered up and they were just any dust, they were like, I'm gonna suck it up.
Okay, last one. What's Hammer of the Gods?
Oh, Hammer of the Gods is one of my first vibrators. It was a vibrator that my best friend and I shared.
Why? Why did you share?
We were very close. We didn't use it at the same time, but we were roommates and we were both professional dominatrices at the same time. So we had we spoke very openly about sexuality in our household, and one of our clients at the dungeon had gifted this giant, neither of us would ever have bought this thing. It was literally as big as my arm, except its fist was even bigger than my fist. And it bent at the elbow, which is why we called it the Hammer of the Gods. And so we would just when we were procrastinating or whatever, we would just be like, do you have it? Yell across the hall and go stomp into each other's rooms and unplug it and bring it into but you basically had to wear jeans when you were using it because it was so powerful. Like it didn't have a low setting.
Wow.
You could have done demo with that thing.
Melissa, you have really lived, and I admire you so much. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much,
Dina.
Dina.